So Niall Ferguson is a historian based here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in California. He joins us here at the Munich Security Conference. Niall, thanks for speaking to DW. So it's kind of striking that at this year's Munich Security Conference, obviously there's a lot of anxiety about Ukraine, there's a lot of anxiety about the Middle East. The one area where there's less tension in the air, at least here at the moment, is between US and China, especially compared to last year at this conference when the spy balloon was just happening and the air was really full of that tension. So how should we think about that? Everyone talks about the temperature is lowering a little bit between the US and China, but the structural tensions between the two haven't gone away, have they?
No, they haven't. And although the summit that happened in California back in November, which brought Xi Jinping and Joe Biden together near where I live in Woodside, went well, in reality, the underlying sources of tension haven't gone away. In particular, the fact that the Chinese regard the US as pursuing a policy of technological containment, that hasn't gone away. The tariffs haven't gone away. The friction over the South China Sea hasn't gone away. And so the fundamental reasons for this Cold War atmosphere have not gone away. What we're seeing, though, is détente. The Cold War isn't over, but the two superpowers are at least talking. And the most important thing that happened this year so far is something that did not happen. There was not a crisis over Taiwan. And that's a sign, I think, that something meaningful was achieved at San Francisco to make sure that we didn't actually end up with our own version of the Cuban Missile Crisis over Taiwan.
So, of course, we know what happened after détente. Eventually, the Cold War did end. Let's look a bit into the future. It's probably too early to say, but what are the things according to which we should judge how well or badly this is going?
Well, as an historian and one who's spent a lot of time thinking about the Cold War recently, I would say that détente in the 1970s worked quite well for the United States. It brought the Soviet Union into a discourse about a whole range of issues, including arms control and even technology transfer. It led to the Helsinki Final Act, which turned out to be quite a mistake for the Soviet Union to sign, and it gave the US breathing space to recover from the fiasco of Vietnam, so that by the time Ronald Reagan was elected, actually the US was in a much stronger position than it had been in say, 1969, whereas the Soviet Union was in the process of overreaching. It had invaded Afghanistan, it was also engaged in Angola, and this overstretch ultimately led to a Soviet disintegration. Now, the question is, does the same playbook work in Cold War II? In other words, is all that the United States really need to do engage in détente, spend the next 10 years negotiating with China about semiconductors, climate change, and anything else you can think of, and wait for the kind of pathologies of a one-party state to take their toll? George Kennan predicted that the Soviet Union would ultimately succumb if you just contained it for long enough. I think Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken have a similar plan. Just contain China, play for time, avoid a showdown, avoid a conflict, and let the pathologies of a one-party state once again play out. And in demographics and in debt dynamics, and in the general slowdown that we've seen in China's economy, I think you see the first evidence that this strategy might work. But for it to work, the US and its allies have to stay on the same page. And of course, at the moment, there are all kinds of reasons why that might not be true.
Yeah, and I mean, I was in Taiwan also recently for the election, and it does seem that, you see pretty much the same story in Taiwan, that Taiwan's only strategy is to cling on and hope that it outlasts China. Just quickly, in talking about the sort of one-party dynamics you refer to, Xi Jinping is, of course, he's extended his ability to stay in office, perhaps ad infinitum, compared to what was the practice in China before that, of having a sort of every 2 terms a change. How much do you think that is putting China at risk, that its own system, which had proven pretty enduring, could come under strain because he's consolidated too much power in his own hands?
Well, nobody gets to reign ad infinitum. We're all mortal, including Xi Jinping and, for that matter, Vladimir Putin. And I think it's important to realize that at some point there will have to be decisions about succession in both China and Russia. And unfortunately, authoritarian regimes are quite bad at succession planning. That's one of the reasons that they come unstuck, either because there's a fight over succession or because somebody who's not really very good takes over, or in the case of the Soviet Union, somebody who's far too radical who inadvertently breaks the system. So I think what happens in China over a 10-year time horizon seems to be not likely to be Xi Jinping is there for the entire duration. I would be surprised if that were the case. I'd be surprised if 10 years from now Vladimir Putin was still running Russia. So we sometimes forget that our enemies are mortal. And the West doesn't have this problem because we have a system of changing leaders through elections, which may not deliver the best leaders, but it doesn't produce succession crises of the sort that I think we'll see in both China and Russia at some point within the decade.
So you would see this essentially as a kind of a game of stamina then between the autocracies and the democracies. Right now, there's a kind of a wild card inserted into all of this in the Middle East. You've been raising more warnings about Iran. Obviously, we don't know where the conflict in Gaza is heading. Talk to me about the wild cards there and how they could play into these bigger geopolitical conflicts.
Well, I've been a critic of the Biden administration's Middle East policy because I thought that the Trump administration's was quite good. The Abraham Accords were a success. Iran was contained by sanctions, and it seemed as if Israel was going to establish a succession of agreements to coexist peacefully with its Arab neighbors. The Biden administration came in January 2021 and said, nope, we're going to put all that to one side and try and resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal. We're going to ease the sanctions on Iran to incentivize them. And lo and behold, what did Iran do with the additional money? Well, gave it mostly to its proxies, the likes of Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis. And these proxies have been playing havoc. Most spectacularly in October the 7th, but actually it had been going on before then, and it's going on since then. And at some point, there's likely to be a further escalation, because I don't think Hezbollah has acquired all those rockets and missiles just to polish them and admire them of an afternoon. So the crazy and worrying thing is that this strategy of trying to resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal has gone horribly wrong, is likely to produce more conflict, and one wonders just where we will be if that war on Israel's northern border were to break out. So there's a lot more that can go wrong in the Middle East. A lot of people in the region give the impression that they're waiting for Donald Trump to come back. This is the curious paradox. Europeans dread the return of Donald Trump. Many people in the Middle East rather hope he'll come back. I think both groups are exaggerating the importance of a change of president. And this is a habitual problem in Europe where they think that Democratic presidents are good and Republican presidents are bad. And it's sort of a delusion here. At the Munich Security Conference, I've heard the name Trump more often than I've heard any other name. And that's because there's an exaggerated sense that if he is re-elected, NATO's gone, Ukraine's gone, and who else knows what may be gone. I think this is to exaggerate how big a discontinuity there would be. Biden continued Trump's China policy. It was the Middle East policy that they changed, and I think that change turned out to be a mistake.
I mean, presumably the Biden administration would point the blame in the other direction, saying that it was Trump's mistake to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal in the first place. But just quickly to pick up on one thing that Tony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, said today, he was kind of talking up this idea that's been, bubbling around recently in the U.S. media as well, of a sort of a grand bargain for the Middle East, where you have a proper move to a two-state solution, you have isolation of Iran, and that you have Saudi Arabia doing both a security deal with the US and recognizing Israel. It seems that the Biden administration is keen on this. We're hearing this from Tony Blinken, raising sort of the prospects of this today. What do you think of that? Is that a realistic prospect in the last few months of this first term of Biden?
Well, what's interesting about this is that so many parts of it resemble what was happening up until 2020 with the Abraham Accords. The thing that's different is this insistence that there has to be a Palestinian state. The problem is that I think the disillusionment in Israel with that idea is at an all-time high. And this is a very, very hard thing to sell to the Israelis. So I'm skeptical that there is going to be a two-state solution, given all that has happened. The Palestinian Authority is an oxymoron. It has no authority. Hamas is either going to be destroyed or some rump of it will survive in Gaza. It is extremely hard for me to see a grand bargain in the wake of October the 7th. The most that I think we can hope for is that we avoid further escalation, that we don't have a war between Hezbollah and Israel, and that over time feelings become a little bit down, because I don't think the Arab states want this state of affairs. I think they hope the Abraham Accords would be the basis ultimately for further deals of the sort that were going to happen, was supposed to happen between Israel and Saudi Arabia. October the 7th derailed a lot. Expecting to be able to pull a grand bargain out of the hat after utterly failing to deter Iran over a 3-year period, I think that's a stretch.
Let's just, before we finish, talk about Trump. Like you said, the elephant in the room, everyone talking about him. You said that you feel that European fears are maybe overblown. But he did say recently that, his statement was quite understandably taken as cause for concern, where he said in this rally that if he felt a certain country was not contributing enough to NATO, that he would even egg the Russians on to sort of have a go. Why do you feel that shouldn't be so much cause for concern?
Well, Donald Trump's way of speaking is not that of other presidents. The psychology here is to make the Europeans realize that they can no longer continue spending less than 2% of GDP on defense while the US spends 3.5%. It can't be justified that the US pays for 69% of the total defense spending of NATO. 69%, more than 2/3. It's not like Europe is poor. It's not like the Germans couldn't afford it. They simply choose not to. And it makes no sense at all. What is interesting about the last 50 years is that president after president after president has said, we really need to talk about burden sharing. And the Europeans have said, yes, we really do need to talk about burden sharing, and nothing has changed. The only president to get the Europeans actually to start spending more on defense was Donald Trump. So this language upsets Europeans, but they need to get upset. This free riding that has been going on, especially since the end of the Cold War, is unsustainable politically. You cannot expect voters in, let's say, Michigan to feel that it is their obligation to provide security for Germans in Central Europe when the threat of Russia is so much closer to Germany than it is to Michigan. It makes no sense.
Absolutely. But isn't it, in fact, really the shock of the invasion of Ukraine that is what finally kind of gave that real shove to defense spending, for instance, in Germany, which will this year, I think, for the first time hit 2% in many, many years, rather than those warnings from Donald Trump?
Well, I don't think German defense spending will hit 2% this year. I'd be very amazed. If you talk to my friends at the Kiel Institute, whose new paper on guns and butter has just come out, Germany has never spent so little on defense in its history. It's actually spending less relative to GDP than it was required to under the Weimar Republic, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So Germany has a very long way to go before it's spending anything like what it needs to spend. And the arguments against increased defense spending in this country make no sense. The debt brake is a very blunt instrument for maintaining fiscal rectitude. National security is not some kind of frivolous consumption. It's insurance against future disaster, and it's investment. And Germany needs to invest in defense technology. It has the capacity to be a really major defense economy. But it doesn't do it because of what seems to me to be economically somewhat primitive notions. So the national security situation was radically changed by the Ukraine war, but it has also changed because of Donald Trump's election, which, remember, happened 6 years before Russia's invasion in 2022. The world is changing. The transatlantic alliance is not forever, because nothing in history is forever. And Europeans have to recognize that if you go around talking about strategic autonomy, and I've heard strategic autonomy until I'm almost sick of the phrase, at some point somebody's going to ask you to deliver it, and not just in a speech, in reality.
Niall Ferguson, thanks so much. A foretaste there of some of the arguments that we might be getting from across the pond later this year. Thanks for speaking to DW today.
Thanks, Richard.